Maya had forgotten what laughter felt like inside that house. Days passed in silence that hummed louder than any argument could. She moved like a shadow through her own home, cooking for three, though most nights only one plate was touched. The sound of Faisal's keys in the door had once meant comfort, but now it only marked another evening of polite distance. He had learned the art of disappearing without ever leaving. Business trips stretched longer, phone calls shorter. His words had become formal, as though he spoke to a stranger sharing his roof, not the woman who once knew every shade of his smile. Rayhan noticed everything. He was 20, but carried the maturity of a man twice his age. Unlike his father, he was always there, helping, listening, filling the silences that had started to choke the house. When Faisal's absence grew routine, Rayhan's presence became Maya's stability. They would talk during dinner, about his classes, her childhood, and sometimes about nothing at all. His laughter broke the monotony, his kindness softened her loneliness. It was a kind of warmth Maya hadn't felt in years, and she clung to it like a lost memory she wasn't ready to let go of. The more Faisal withdrew, the more Rayhan stepped in, helping her fix things around the house, reminding her to eat, asking if she was sleeping well. What began as ordinary care slowly turned into emotional dependence. Late at night, when the house felt emptier than usual, Maya found herself waiting for Rayhan to come home, listening for his footsteps, the familiar creak of his door opening. His presence made the silence bearable. One night, after dinner, she found herself telling him things she'd never said aloud, how her marriage had turned hollow, how she'd stopped recognizing herself in the mirror. Rayhan listened quietly, eyes filled with empathy that felt too deep, too personal. When she apologized for talking too much, he said softly, "You never talk too much, Mama. You've been quiet for too long." His words settled in her chest like warmth, something dangerous yet comforting. Days turned into weeks, and those small exchanges became their ritual. A word here, a glance there, each carrying unspoken emotion. Maya tried to ignore the unease that came with it. She told herself it was harmless, just love between mother and son. But sometimes, when he looked at her, there was something in his eyes she couldn't name. It wasn't inappropriate, not yet, but it lingered at the edge of something she didn't dare define. She began to feel guilt without knowing why. The way she waited for his messages, how her heart lifted when he complimented her, even over something as small as her cooking. She had been starved of affection for so long that she no longer recognized the boundary between gratitude and emotional need. Each evening, when Faisal's absence stretched late into the night, she would sit with Rayhan, talking until the clock hit midnight. Sometimes, the lights would dim, and their words would trail off into silence, both of them lost in thoughts they couldn't speak. One afternoon, she found herself brushing her hair a little longer before dinner. The thought hit her halfway through, why? For whom? The realization stung. She set the brush down and stared at her reflection, seeing exhaustion, guilt, and a faint, foolish hope she couldn't explain. It wasn't desire, it was something far lonelier, more desperate, a craving to be seen again, to feel important to someone. Rayhan's care deepened with time. He would bring her tea without asking, fix her scarf when it slipped, and notice when she was sad even if she said nothing. It was pure on the surface, yet charged underneath with something fragile. When he said, "You look tired, Mama," his tone carried a softness that felt almost protective. She should have corrected it, redefined it, but instead she let it be, because in that softness, she found peace. The house began to revolve around their quiet companionship. Faisal called less often, Maya answered even less. Every unanswered ring became easier than explaining what she didn't feel anymore. Rayhan, without knowing, had become her confidant, her emotional home. They never crossed a physical line, but their closeness carried a silence so intimate it could no longer be called ordinary. Sometimes at night, Maya prayed not for her husband, but for the confusion inside her heart to fade. She told herself it was only loneliness, that it would pass once Faisal came home more often, once things felt normal again. But normal had left long ago. She didn't realize how fragile the balance had become, how close emotion was to turning into something neither of them could take back. One evening, after dinner, they sat in the living room, quiet as the television flickered with low light. Maya's hand brushed against his accidentally, and for a moment, neither moved. The air felt heavier than before, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. She pulled her hand back quickly, heart pounding, realizing something had shifted, silently but permanently. That night, as she lay awake, she thought of her life, her marriage, and her son, three threads tangled beyond repair. She wanted to believe the closeness came from love, but deep down she knew love wasn't supposed to feel this complicated. The narrator's voice would whisper through the silence. It began with care, grew with understanding, and was sustained by loneliness. And loneliness, when fed too long, begins to disguise itself as love. By the time dawn touched the curtains, Maya knew something irreversible had begun, not through words, not through actions, but through silence itself. A silence that carried warmth, guilt, and danger all at once. It was the start of something she could neither explain nor escape, and though nothing had been said yet, everything had already changed. The rain had started without warning, tapping against the windows like a quiet confession. The power went out soon after, leaving only the faint glow of a candle between them. Maya and Rehan sat in the living room, the silence stretching longer than usual. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't innocent either. She could feel his gaze on her, not heavy, but searching, as if he wanted to say something that had been building for days. When she asked if something was wrong, he just smiled weakly and said he was tired of seeing her sad. His voice carried a weight that made her uneasy. He began talking about Faisal, about how his father didn't deserve her patience, her loyalty, her quiet endurance. Every word sounded like a defense of her pain, but the tone beneath it trembled with emotion. "You've spent your whole life taking care of people who don't see you," he said. "You deserve someone who does." She tried to laugh it off, but it came out hollow. His eyes didn't move away. The room felt smaller. Maya told him to stop, to not speak about his father that way, but her voice lacked conviction. He shook his head and continued. "I hate seeing you cry," he said. "You pretend you're fine, but you're not. And he doesn't care. He doesn't see you, but I do." The words landed like stones, heavy and deliberate. She tried to interrupt, but he spoke over her. "You don't have to be alone anymore." Something inside her stilled. She didn't understand what he meant, or perhaps she did but refused to accept it. The air between them was thick with something neither of them could name. She told him he was speaking nonsense, that he should go to sleep, but he didn't move. His expression softened, and what came next shattered every line she had drawn in her mind. "If he doesn't love you," Rehan said quietly, "then let me be the one who does." The candle flickered, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. But the look in his eyes told her she had. Time froze, sound disappeared, and she felt her heart thudding painfully inside her chest. She wanted to speak, but no words came out. The boy who had been her comfort had just crossed into something dangerous, and the mother who had been his safe place suddenly felt like a stranger to him. Her first reaction was disbelief. Then came anger, sharp and defensive. Do you even understand what you're saying? She asked, her voice trembling. But he didn't back down. His tone wasn't childish, it wasn't lustful, it was broken, desperate, born from something twisted by loneliness. I just want you to be happy, he said, almost pleading. You deserve to be loved. I can do that. The words made her dizzy. She felt sick, ashamed, guilty, and furious all at once. She stood abruptly, tears burning her eyes, and slapped him, not out of hatred, but out of fear. He didn't react, didn't defend himself, just looked at her with that same quiet pain. I'm sorry, he whispered, but I meant it. Maya stepped back, shaking, unable to breathe properly. The room felt suffocating. Every moment of care, every conversation, every act of kindness replayed in her head, and she saw it all differently now. She wondered if she had caused this. If her loneliness had blurred the lines, if her need for affection had created something unnatural. The thought made her stomach twist. She wanted to scream, to undo the moment, to take back every silence that had led here. Rayhan turned away, his shoulders tense. He didn't cry, but his voice cracked when he said, You don't have to forgive me. Just don't pretend you don't feel it too. The accusation struck her like a wound. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Maybe he was wrong, or maybe somewhere deep inside, she had felt something she never dared to acknowledge. The thought terrified her. He walked out into the rain, leaving the door half open behind him. Maya sank onto the couch, her legs trembling. She stared at the candle burning low, the wax dripping down like time melting away. Her hands were cold, her thoughts chaotic. What had she done? What had they done? The bond that once gave her comfort now felt poisoned. She sat there for hours, replaying every conversation, every look, every moment she'd let slip by without question. She wanted to blame him, but a cruel voice inside reminded her she had needed his warmth just as much. Maybe her silence had invited it. Maybe her tears had drawn him closer. Maybe loneliness had made them both blind. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with the residue of what had been said. She couldn't bring herself to face him, couldn't bear to think of how to fix what had been broken. All she could do was sit there, wrapped in guilt and disbelief. The narrator's voice would echo softly through the quiet. Love had crossed the line, not by touch, but by thought. Maya didn't sleep that night. She waited for morning, for the sound of normal life, birds, sunlight, noise, but nothing felt normal anymore. She knew the boundary that once kept her world safe had been shattered in one sentence, one request she could never unhear. Nothing had happened physically, yet everything had changed. Her home was still the same, but she wasn't. Neither was he. And though no one outside those walls would ever know, the truth would live there forever, in every silence, in every glance, in every unspoken word that could never be taken back. Morning came quietly, as if the world itself was careful not to disturb what had broken overnight. The house looked the same, but the air inside carried the heaviness of unspoken guilt. Maya moved through the kitchen mechanically, her hands doing what her mind refused to. The sound of Rayhan's door remained closed, and she didn't dare knock. Between them now existed a silence sharper than any words could ever be. She wanted to believe time would dull it, that pretending would fix what truth had shattered, but even silence had a pulse, and she could feel it every time she breathed. When Rayhan finally came out, his face was pale, his eyes swollen from a sleepless night. He greeted her softly, avoiding eye contact, and she answered with the same hollow politeness. They spoke of ordinary things, breakfast, the weather, his classes, but each word felt artificial, rehearsed. There was no anger, No confrontation, only the heavy politeness of two people pretending they had not crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The simple rhythm of daily life became their disguise. Days slipped by. Faisal called once from another city, asking if everything was fine. Maya said yes. Her voice sounded calm even though her heart wasn't. Rayhan stood nearby, listening, guilt flickering across his face. When the call ended, she turned to him briefly, wanting to say something, anything, but words wouldn't come. They both went back to their separate silences, each drowning in their own version of regret. At night, Maya lay awake, replaying his words over and over. If he doesn't love you, let me be the one who does. They echoed inside her mind until she wanted to scream. It wasn't the sentence itself that haunted her, but what it revealed, how much her own sadness had shaped it. She had spent years starving for affection, and in her loneliness, she had allowed boundaries to blur. Rayhan's request was wrong, but it was born from the very emptiness she had carried. That realization made her shame even deeper. Rayhan, meanwhile, became distant. He stopped sitting with her, avoided her eyes, and left early for university. He moved like someone trying to punish himself quietly. His laughter disappeared, replaced by long silences and guilt he couldn't hide. One night, Maya found a piece of paper on the dining table, a letter written in his neat handwriting. It wasn't dramatic, just a simple confession of remorse. He wrote that he didn't know what came over him, that he hated himself for saying what he said, and that he wished she could forget it ever happened. At the end, he had written, "I only wanted you to be happy." I forgot what that meant. She folded the letter carefully and kept it in a drawer she never opened again. When Faisal finally returned home after weeks, the irony was cruel. He brought gifts, spoke with fake warmth, and acted like everything was fine. He didn't notice the strained quiet between his wife and son. He was too used to silence to see that this one was different. During dinner, he joked about how Rayhan had become the man of the house. Maya forced a smile. Rayhan excused himself early. Faisal didn't notice the tremor in her hand when she picked up her glass. That night, Maya stood by Rayhan's door for a long time before knocking. When he opened it, she saw in his eyes a boy crushed under the weight of something he couldn't undo. She didn't lecture or scold. Her voice was soft, tired, but steady. She told him that they would never speak of that night again, not because she wanted to forget it, but because remembering it would destroy them both. "We'll move forward," she said quietly, "and you'll promise me to live your life, not carry my pain." He nodded, tears gathering but unfallen. For a moment, they stood in silence that felt almost forgiving. He said, "I'm sorry, Mama." She replied, "I know," and placed her hand lightly on his head before walking away. That simple gesture, pure, motherly, final, closed the distance between guilt and forgiveness without a single word more. It didn't erase what had happened, but it anchored it in a place where it could no longer grow. In the days that followed, life settled into a fragile rhythm again. Rayhan focused on his studies, Maya on her work. Faisal continued to drift in and out, oblivious to the emotional ruins he had left behind. But something inside both Maya and Rayhan had changed permanently. Their bond remained, but it was different now, restrained, quiet, shaped by an unspoken promise never to repeat the past. Sometimes, when the house grew quiet at night, Maya would hear the faint echo of rain and feel the weight of that memory pressing at the edges of her mind. It didn't hurt anymore, it simply reminded her how thin the line was between love and loneliness. She no longer blamed him entirely. She blamed time, distance, and silence. The perfect storm that had swallowed judgment. Years would pass, and no one outside those walls would ever know the truth. Rayhan would grow older, leave for work in another city, build his own life. Maya would remain where she was, living a version of peace that came with acceptance rather than forgetting. Sometimes his calls would come late at night, short and polite, and she would hear in his voice that same quiet care, this time with the right distance between them, and though the past remained unspoken, it lingered in the air of that house like the faint scent of rain after a storm, proof that something had happened once, something that changed them both forever. The narrator's voice would fade over that silence. Sometimes betrayal has no villain, and forgiveness has no hero. It is just two hearts learning to live with what they cannot erase. Some truths are not confessed because they are too dark, but because speaking them would only keep them alive. And so they carried it quietly, she as a mother who forgave, and he as a son who would never forgive himself. The house stood still, ordinary to the world, yet inside its walls lived a story no one would ever tell again, a story of love misunderstood, of silence mistaken for safety, of a truth that would sleep forever between them, untouched, but never truly gone.